Hi everyone, it's Rachel, and today I'm going to be doing a commission of a corgi painting that I did for a client, and I'll just go over some things and how the process works for me if you guys are interested in tutorial type videos. So this will be for you guys. This one is going to be a watercolor mixed media painting. So what I always do first is I go ahead and block in my colors. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm blocking in those dark values. I'm doing the wet on wet method, where I just kind of lay out my my values in the painting. And I go through and I do that all over to give me a really good map. That way I can come back through and add in all of my details and things like that. So this dog was laying on a blanket, so that's what that gray is there. And if you ever are wanting to move on to the next layer, you can always use that hair dryer that I was using there. That really helps speed up that drying process. So I go in with my watercolor pencils here and just define those dark areas. I feel like with the watercolor pencils I have a really good map, if you will, of where I need to go, and these ones are the are high quality watercolor pencils, so they blend really well. You don't get any of those grainy pencil marks. So after I do that, I go through and I add water to blend this layer out. This just really defines those dark layers, so that I can come back through and add more detail in here soon. But this is not really wet on wet. You want to make sure that with each layer, especially if you're doing watercolor pencils, that each layer is dry. So for my first layer, I laid it all out, and then I used that hair dryer to dry it, and then I went back through with those watercolor pencils, and after I added that layer and I made it wet, I am going to wait for it to dry again. That way it doesn't actually bleed in with the next one. So here I'm putting in the nose. Now, something to remember about doing realistic noses is that with the areas that are very dark like that look completely black, if you look closer in the actual reference photo, normally the black noses are not as black as they might seem. So making sure that you do even the really dark areas layer by layer, and adding those values up, because you can always add more. Well, not always, but most of the time you can add more. It's harder to take away, especially when you're using watercolor pencils like I am there. But yeah, so I just add in those dark grays and those spots that are 100% pitch black, and then I let that dry, and I continue to build up those layers over time. So that's what I'm continuing to do with the background and the eyes. With the eyes, I really like to make the eyes pop. I feel like in paintings, it's the eyes, especially portraits, that really make the subject come to life. So in the reference photo, the eyes were really dark, and I wanted to make it as accurate as possible, but I also really wanted those eyes to pop. So what you'll see me do is add in a little bit lighter brown rather than that really deep brown, and the whites of the eyes are not 100% white, but making it that like gray glossy, so that it looks more realistic. So after I add in all of my watercolor values and I shade all that out and everything's dry, I go back in, and what you'll see me do is go back in with color pencil, and this is where I add all of my really fine details. So I'm just adding in the background. It's just a gray background, so I'm using watercolor pencils just to kind of quickly fill that in. And then I will go back through with color pencil on the actual subject, and I'll really start to fill in all of the little details. And so As you'll see in this reference photo, there is a lot of detail in the blanket, but the client wasn't really concerned about the detail in the blanket, so I wasn't really worried about that. So I just kept that a simple gray to really kind of make the subject, you know, the dog be the primary area of focus. So I'm just going through and I'm adding in those little tiny details that you'll see. Now with colored pencil, I really like to lay down the first few layers with watercolor and then add my colored pencil on top anytime that I want to use colored pencil. That's just my personal preference. There are so many ways that you can incorporate colored pencil with, you know, anything that you're well, not anything, but most things. If you want to use colored pencil, there's many different options as far as blending and layering and things like that, but for me, I really like to, if I'm working with colored pencil, lay down my first few layers with watercolor first, again for that roadmap. Now with colored pencil, if you are interested in a more in-depth tutorial about exactly how to use colored pencil with watercolor and things like that, to add those little fine details and everything, let me know and I can do a video about creating those really fine details with colored pencil and watercolor and how to use those two things successfully together. But for this quick little tutorial, I'm just kind of going over, you know, mostly what my process is when I'm doing pet portraits and how I incorporate that. So but yeah, so I go through and I use those to get those little tiny hairs and everything. You do not have to do every single hair when it comes to pet portraits. When you're making fur, I feel like it's mostly the values that matter the most. So those, you know, your shading and things like that. Little hairs are going to really make your portrait come to life, but at the same time, you just, you know, I feel like a lot of people think that it's all about the color of, like, getting every single color 100% accurate, where you do, you know, color is definitely important and it plays a big role, but at the same time, when you're looking at a subject, if you get all of your values right, but your color seems a little bit off, it's still going to look really realistic and like the subject, because all of your shading and the values are all correct. So that's what I really want to focus on, is making sure that every specific detail as far as the value is what I'm mostly focusing on here, not necessarily every single hair or 100% the correct color or things like that. So with the nose, I'm just going back in and I'm adding in those little details, just building up those layers and making sure that I can see the different variations in the nose, because if you just have a big black circle, it's not going to look very realistic. So there are different areas where you can go through and make them like lighter gray, or, you know, whatever your reference photo is. So I'm just going through, there's a little bit of shading at the top, so I'm going in and in my portraits I really like to portray the really bold differences. So for instance, if you have a reference photo, you want to stick to the reference photo as much as possible, but for me, I really like my portraits to pop, so I sometimes go a little bit more aggressive if there's a highlight, you know, it's really bright, or you know, if there's a dark area, then it can, you know, look really deep. It's just kind of, I feel like that's hard to explain or hard to define, or and things, or teach, I guess. But yeah, I just kind of eyeball it, if you will, just, you know, in a way that I think that it's gonna make the subject really pop and look really nice. So I go through and I'm just adding the little white hairs on the nose. There was actually quite a few white hairs on this kiddo's nose, so I'm going through and I'm adding those little tiny details with the little white hairs. And so I did start to make the body on this side. What you'll see me do later is actually paint over that, and that's because I decided that I really liked it a lot better if I just had the subject's face. I felt like for this one specifically, since in the reference photo, back end of the body, it was kind of blurry or blurred out, and the head and face were really, really focused. I decided to actually just make the head be the focus, so I actually end up, going over that, but essentially I'm just laying in those values again, that roadmap where I want to go back through and finish, shading that all out. But with colored pencil, I go through and I make sure that all of the colors that I want to be incorporated into one area are all down before I actually burnish. So burnish is just, pushing really hard and making sure that, you get all of the tooth of the paper out. And before I do that and really blend it in nicely like that, I make sure that I lay down all of the different values and colors and things like that that I want to have in that section of the painting. So here I'm just using gouache, which is just a really, really opaque white that I like to use in these portraits, so I can go through and any like little white furs that I can see sticking out. This just adds really, really nice detail to paintings. So I'm just going through and adding in those white hairs that I see throughout the subject, and that just really, really helps the portrait pop. And see here again, the eyes are kind of coming to life with me adding in those white colors. I really feel like it's important to, if you're doing a subject, especially of an animal, that those eyes are, the focus point. And so I am finishing this portrait by just going in and adding the last few details. I really appreciate it. I really, really loved making this one, so I'm just cropping it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!